Okay, so this is a brief review of chapter 3, Spanning the World. Okay, so, you know, in this chapter, they talk a lot about how definitions of masculinity and femininity are different in different cultures around the world, right? So when anthropologists began to explore the cultural landscape, they found that there were far more variability in the definitions of masculinity and femininity than any biologist would have predicted before, doing that kind of anthropological work. So Margaret Mead really explored the processes by which males and females become men and women in a culture. So she found that cultures seemed, really interesting when it came to this rite of passage, right? Or these understandings of what it meant to be a man or what it meant to be a woman. So she did find cultures where they seemed to be the kind of opposite of our own, where females were aggressive and men were adorning themselves, right, in order to get women's sexual attention. She found some cultures where they were headhunters, right? So there was very little gender distinction at all, and both men and women were expected to be aggressive. And she found other cultures that were very egalitarian structures, right? They didn't have the kind of same distinctions as well. So each culture believed that men and women were the way they were because their biological sex determined their personality. So none of them believed that women and men were the outcome of economic scarcity or military success or cultural arrangements or all these other kind of factors, right? Just that it was all coming from biology. And if that were true, why so much variability, right? Why is she finding so many different cultures? So really, there's an enormous cultural variations and definitions of masculinity and femininity around the world. So labor is something that in almost every society has been divided by gender. So some tasks are reserved for women, some for men. So functionalist theory argues that a sex-based division of labor was necessary for the preservation of American society. So as society became more complex, there became a dichotomy of roles, right? So they're basically going back to the kind of caveman, hunter-gatherer. Again, remember, we got to be careful about those narratives and just how much of that we actually understand. So they argued that it was necessary to divide labor within the culture, right? But on the other hand, the sexual division of labor has a history, again, itself. So it's definitely not biologically inevitable, as societies have changed and are going to continue to change. So, but this gender-based division of labor has definitely become a big part of our culture. It's not reflective of bodily differences because men no longer need strength and aggression to perform most jobs, right? Most people sit on ass at work, right? Let's be real. So giving women reproductive choices has given them the opportunity to, get into this institution of work instead of being kind of at the mercy of, their body, I guess, not having the choice of whether or not to be parents. So, from the industrialization period, we have this fun thing called the wage labor economy happen, right? Of course, now we have to work, which totally sucks, right? So there was this idea that there were two different spheres, the public sphere and the private sphere, right? And that there was one for men and one for women, right? Hint, men public, women private, right? So this is why women were restricted from education, from voting, from some specific work industries, because of course women always worked. That just, when we tend to look at history, we tend to essentialize white middle to upper white women's class, their experiences, not the actual women. That there's other women, turns out, than just rich white women. There's poor white women, right? There's women of color, right? There's all sorts of different kinds of women. And a lot of them worked, but they didn't work in the same industries typically that men were working in. There were different kinds of industries. But anyway, it was definitely frowned upon, right? And we'll talk about that too, the kind of the way that being a wealthy person was essentialized and privileged in the culture, so that's why everyone wanted it, right? Anyway. So there's this kind of idea like women stay at home in the private sphere where they're, so moralistic, right? They have all this emotion. They're good for raising kids and managing a family and a home, right? versus men, they're aggressive and strong, and therefore they have to go out into these horrible, mean streets, the dog eat dog world of, voting, I guess. Um, so, yeah, anyway. There's this idea that there was a sphere for men, a sphere for women, and it really justified the differences. So again, when it comes down to this idea, you really look at power, right? So why does the gender difference remain if it's not based on physical differences, right? If nowadays it's not about being physically strong to do your job, then why is it still such a dichotomy? Why is it so important to have these kind of divisions? Because it's really a power relationship that's been cemented into the established institutions in our culture. So we have to kind of, exercise that demon out in order to build a more egalitarian system. So when it comes to sexual division of labor, several different theories have tried to explain sexual division of labor and really the gender inequality that, comes as a result of it to the large structural forces that transform society's organizing principles. So one of these would be private property and the materialism of male domination. So Ingalls and Marx suggested that three chief institutions of modern Western society, the capitalist economy, the nation state, and the nuclear family, emerged at roughly the same historical moment and were the result of the development of private property. So really, private property is what caused, in their view, this sexual division of labor that was really negatively affecting women. So really, again, capitalism meant private ownership and the transmission of inheritance across generations. So this keeps all the wealth within a very limited class of people. So out of intergenerational inheritance came the traditional nuclear family, with monogamous marriage and the sexual control of women by men. So when it comes to this market economy, this shifted basic egalitarian roles towards male dominance. So they're arguing that the actual structure of the economy itself favored this kind of power relationship in the larger culture. Another way to understand this, other anthropologists are arguing that origins of male domination come from imperatives of war in primitive societies, right? So warrior societies that tend to exclude women and relegate them to lower status in a social hierarchy. So the determinants of a woman's status in most societies, there's some differentiation between women and men, and they tend to have distinct patterns of gendered inequality and male domination, right? So some cultures are a little bit more forgiving than others, a little bit more egalitarian than others, right? So, women who have reproductive freedom have a higher status in society, and they also have more opportunities in the larger society. So that's why having childcare, having reproductive freedom and status, these things are very important for women, not just for their financial lives, but for their safety, right? And so this sex segregation, really just means that the lower a woman's status is in the society that she lives in, the more likely she is to face violence and sexual violence. So sex segregation was highly associated with women's lower status, as if separation is necessary for the development of sexual inequality and male dominance. So when they took this into this kind of research, cross-cultural research on the female status and male dominance, they found a few things they talk about in the book, so I'll go over a couple of them. First, they found that male dominance is lower when men and women work together with little sexual division of labor. So this means that sex segregation is the strongest predictor of a woman's status. So if you live in a culture that has very strong sex segregation in their labor force, that's going to cause different social realities on the day-to-day for men and women. That means they're going to be segregated from each other. They're not going to understand each other in the same way. So it's fascinating that sex segregation is the strongest predictor of a woman's status within this cross-cultural research study. Second thing they found was that male dominance is more pronounced when men control political and ideological resources that are necessary to achieve the goals of the culture, and when men control all property, right? Going back to the kind of Marx and Engels example of how capitalism itself was part of this, right? So male dominance is exacerbated under colonization. So both capitalist, this kind of control capitalism has of, moving from countryside to industrialization, this generally lowered women's status, because before this, if most people lived in kind of a homestead situation, or like the labor economy itself wasn't based on wages in the same way, it was based on often, farm producing goods or services, then you were both, like, if there's not as much a sexual division of labor in the household as much when you're both getting up to work on the farm early as hell in the morning, right? So there's not as much of a distinction between men's and women's work. When you're working it from the home, it's all work, right? But once they start opening factories and they start paying men more to work in factories than women, you start getting this kind of change because of the capitalist wage economy that then, basically relegates women to a lower status and gives them lower pay as a result of that. And there's a big, long historical chain of that happening since kind of the dawn of industrialization. But it makes sense because, if everyone's working out of the home, that's just work. But now, if men are getting good wages to work outside of the home, then the work that needs to still be done at home to maintain the home is going to be considered women's work, and then it becomes unpaid, right? So anyway, they also found in the study that male dominance is associated with demographic imbalances between the sexes. So just meaning the higher the percentage of marriageable men to marriageable women, the lower the women's status. So that's an interesting finding as well. And the last one they really talked about a lot in the chapter was how environmental stresses tend to exaggerate male domination. So if there are, other kind of conflicts or problems within a culture, that's just going to exacerbate this issue even more. Okay, so when it comes to cross-cultural explanations of rape itself is a cultural phenomenon by which relations between men are cemented. That's really what the chapter is trying to talk about, that there's this way that it ensures continued male dominance. So remember, it's cultural in the way that each culture has an explanation or justification for why it's done. Like within our own culture, we have the caveman narrative, we have rape myths that say, a woman wanted it and she's lying, or these kind of things. So there's often a cultural understanding of how rape operates within that particular society, right? So, but it tends to be a very gendered situation, as no matter who the victim is, male, female, or non-binary, the perpetrator is almost all overwhelmingly male. So, when they talk about this in the chapter, they're talking about how rape in a lot of cultures is used in warfare, right? As a systematic attempt of one militarized group of males to express and sustain the subordination of a conquered group of males. So this brings a masculinist logic that women are property. So you could disrespect men by raping their women, right? Rape is also seen as restitution for a crime. So in some cultures, women can be sentenced to be raped as punishment for a crime. Often not having sex within a marriage could be this, why they're sentenced to this. So the example in the book is very sad, right? Where a woman was sentenced to rape for sex outside the marriage, a charge that was leveled on her younger brother, not her, who himself was kidnapped and raped, but 3 elders fabricated the sex story to cover up their crimes, and then she was actually, hurt as a result of this horrible system. So again, cultures always have ways to kind of justify the imbalance in power relationships that are very toxic. Also, when it comes to gang rapes, right? This is another way that, another thing that comes up cross-culturally, that this can often cement relationships between men. So in our culture, gang rape is very common, very, very, very common in college fraternities, where men solidify their social order through sexual exploitation of women, right? Through rape, through gang rape, dosing women, in kind of a competitive sex play, right? So, in the chapter, Peggy Sanday, she argues that through gang rape, men can permit a certain amount of homoerotic contact with each other, because, again, men are so kept from each other. They're so policed in their heterosexuality that any sort of contact with another man is already suspect for some sort of deviation of their sexuality. So, this phenomenon really only occurs in cultures that degrade and devalue women, right? Gang rape is a phenomenon that happens quite a bit in our culture, but it's not as common in more egalitarian cultures. So hopefully we can become one of those cultures. When it comes to rituals of gender, the origin of rituals lie in non-biological places. So there's a lot of kind of rituals we have in the culture. And these initiation rituals provide a sense of identity and group membership to the people who participate in them, right? So circumcision is an example of a cultural practice that constricts our understandings of gender, right? We have very different understandings that, why is it that it's accepted in many cultures that men have to have their genitals mutilated, right? This is not something that happens only to men, but also to women in a lot of cultures where girls, they're coming of age, they have their clitoris removed so that they can be accepted in the culture, right? So circumcision is something that's an interesting kind of cultural perspective on why this is necessary. So when it comes to genital mutilation, it's really interesting that we have this kind of different understanding, but of course, we'll go more in depth into that in a second anyway. So both cultures that circumcise men and women tend to be those where men's status is the highest. So for men, the ritual is about male sameness, right? The idea is that they all look the same. But, there's also this idea of difference from women, right? So it can be seen as reinforcing male dominance. And so for women, having their clitoris removed is really about controlling their sexual pleasure, right? Again, showing male control of female sexuality. So some more examples they give is this ritual that men go through, kind of similar to their pregnant partners, in order to empathize with them, right? This kuvad or kuvade, I don't know how to pronounce it. Really interesting. So that they would stay home, they'd follow the same food restrictions, right? But the practice is really there to solidify paternity. So it still can be seen as an issue of male dominance, right? He's not necessarily doing it just to be, gaining some sympathy weight during the pregnancy. He's also kind of making sure it's his. And then there's, they talked about the purdah, the Islamic requirement that women conceal themselves, right? There's this logic that men are at the will of their sexual urges, and that women being covered is considered protecting them from the temptations, that men will fall victim to. But of course, remember, it really doesn't matter what you're wearing. It's really a power dominant situation. So how many genders are there, right? The discussion of gender difference often assumes that differences are based on some biological realities that sort physical creatures into their appropriate categories. So some societies recognize more than two genders, right? In the book, they talked about a lot of these. So I'll just briefly touch on these. The Navajo appear to have three genders, with the natal for those who are born with ambiguous sex criteria at birth. So one can decide to be one later on, or they can be born as one. So these natals perform tasks that are assigned to both women and men, and they dress in the gender whose task they are performing. Though they're typically treated as women and addressed using feminine kinship terms. There's also two-spirit person, right, found in some Native American cultures, sometimes called Berdache, right? They're seen as a distinct third gender. You have the Muxe, which are an indigenous community in Mexico that, again, represent a gender that's not necessarily a gay masculinity, in the sense that they're just kind of seen as transgender. So we'll see a video about that later. The Mojave, right? That they seem to have four distinct genders, and people are permitted to cross genders to carefully demarcated roles within those gender identities. And then, gender fluidity itself can really be associated with gender equality, or it can be associated with less gender equality depending on the culture itself. So how rigid the system of gender is really depends on the culture. It's a reflection of it. So there's been studies of gender fluidity, And they really show how culture constructs both gender and sexuality. Because when it comes down to it, there's a lot of sexual diversity around the world. So in some cultures, homosexuality is illegal or considered immoral, while it's a common practice cross-culturally and, again, in the animal kingdom. So the meanings of same-sex sexuality vary wildly from culture to culture. So some of the examples they give in the book is the ritualized homosexuality, the Sambia and Karaki. So some cultures in Papua New Guinea are known for practicing this ritualized homosexuality, or sexuality for the purposes of transitioning from boys to men, right, as a rite of passage. So in Sambia, boys have to fellate older boys because it's believed that if they don't, the women that are betrothed to them will run away and they'll only be able to produce semen themselves if they ingest it from someone else, right? Similarly, the Karaki believe that transmission of semen is necessary for boys to grow into men, but they're often either, sodomized in some way by older men until they grow into puberty, and then they become men themselves, and they kind of like switch their role within that cultural practice, right? So there are cultures that are more permissive or more restrictive of homosexuality. There's cultures like the Sambia and the Karaki that actually ritualize it. It just becomes a normative part of the culture, right? The cultures that were more permissive, they talked about the Iran, the Saran, Sakraki, Yanamomo. So really all of these cultures, every male is considered a homosexual during adolescence and a bisexual once they're married. All right. So when it comes to sexual behavior, this is something that's not organized around reproduction alone, right? Clearly, culture is playing a role in what we understand about sex. So we think our own behaviors are normal and natural, and that's because we're ethnocentric jerks, right? When it comes to sexual diversity, the practice of sex itself differs greatly around the world. So in the chapter, they talked about how, the book gives these different cultural expectations of sex. Some cultures, men are expected to have an orgasm just once a month, and others, men are expected to have more than 10 a night. So obviously the culture's kind of mitigating that understanding. In some cultures, kissing is considered sexual and erotic. In other cultures, it's considered disgusting and unheard of, right? And just in the same way with foreplay. In some cultures, there's no foreplay at all, right? You would never have sex inside in some cultures, right? Because they believe that if you have sex inside, your food would spoil and go bad. So people have sex outside. So again, our experience of sex and our erotic understandings of what is pleasurable is very culturally constructed. So anthropology has really challenged a lot of those universal arguments about gender because they went and looked at other cultures. And by looking at other cultures, you can see the plurality of differences, right? Margaret Mead could see through those rites of passages the plurality of definitions of what it meant to be a man or a woman within a culture. So anthropology has also challenged the biological inevitability of gender difference throughout history. So we have this horrible problem of reading history backwards, right? We like to apply our current understandings of gender and sexual relations back onto history out of the context of the culture at that time that we're looking at. So some recent cultural inventions, such as the nuclear family, right? That only came about as a result of industrialization. Monogamous marriage, right? Those are kind of recent. The separation of work and home. These all came from post-agricultural organization of society. So in the brutal dominator model they talk about in the chapter, feminist anthropologists see Neolithic societies that were goddess worshipping, gender equal, mutually respectful. But as barbarians invaded, they instituted their own male domination by introducing a singular male god, a violent hierarchical world drenched in the blood of war and murder, right? So that's not great. So the brutal dominator model argues that, it solidifies male dominance, this kind of conquering, male violence, and generally authoritarian social structure that has really become the norm in kind of Western society. So again, the value of cross-cultural research is that by looking at other cultures, we can gain appreciation and for the diversity of expressions across the world, but we can also gain a reflective insight on our own cultural values, right? So we have to look at ourselves and our systems of gender and our systems of sexuality that we often just take for granted as natural and really coming from biological derivation, which again is interesting because that's what Margaret Mead found in her research, right? Is that all of those different cultures all thought that same thing too. So we have to really look at ourselves too and see how our culture is structuring our understandings and meanings and definitions of masculinity and femininity.